Hello, I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars. We're here on the campus of Cornell University. I'm here to attend a roundtable discussion entitled Science Under Siege. I have a feeling it's going to be addressed to worry over the recent announcement by the NIH of reductions in indirect cost rates from about 60% right now to one fourth of that, about 15%. There's a lot of misinformation and I have to say hysteria surrounding this. And so I thought I would come down and have a listen. Cornell University is party to a lawsuit of several universities, research universities. Cornell is a co-plaintiff in several lawsuits that have been filed against the National Institutes of Health to try to either stay or repeal this reduction of indirect cost rates. It's causing a great deal of concern and hysteria among working scientists, and frankly, there's a lot of misinformation that's floating around about that. So, I thought today we would go listen, see what this roundtable discussion has to say, and okay. So, without further ado, let's go inside.
Should we assume when we're trying to answer this question? While the most terrifying developments have happened in the last few months, I think it's clear that this has also been a slow-moving disaster with funding cuts coming for a long time. And it's time to ask larger questions. Just one example, universities have been moving towards collaborations with industry for a long time. The Bayh-Dole Act is 45 years old this year, and there will be a temptation in this movement to move away from federal funding to increased alliances with industries. But we should have a frank conversation about that, how that has skewed and will continue to skew our priorities. And then as we answer the where is here question, we should also ask how international our answer should be. Anyone looking at the state, for example, of British universities right now will see massive funding cuts in multiple areas. Britain has seen a huge turn in the last decades towards the idea of running universities like businesses. And we should ask if that's in any way a good idea. I came across recently a possibly apocryphal story of a Japanese businessman visiting Britain and being told of this university's business plan. His apparent response was, "Why? Your universities are top-notch and your firms are terrible. Why would you do that?" So at least two questions emerge from an international comparison. First, is the problem this or previous American administrations, or is this a larger problem? Is this neoliberalism and an obsession with market logics that's the real problem? And then second, will it turn towards running universities as profit centers savers? Because it's destroying tertiary education elsewhere. And then the second question, of course, well, what's the way forward? To answer that, we need a basic question. Where do we want to get? Can we go back to the system as it was a year ago? Or do we need more radical collaborations to think about building a new funding and research system for the 21st century, now that the once robust 20th century system is crumbling? This is a wretched time, I don't want to underplay that, but it's also a chance to think about processes and practices that we've simply adopted for a long time. And I really think this is where scientists and historians, sociologists, philosophers, anthropologists, scholars of government, etc., need to have real and ongoing conversations. When we answer the question, what's the way forward, we should also talk about time span. We're going to have a different answer if the way forward is a question we're answering for 1 year, for 5 years, for 50 years. And then again, in parallel with the first round of questions, what's the geographical scope of this answer? Can America go it alone, or do we need to build international or at least regional collaboration in from the very beginning? So, we have gathered together a whole bunch of fantastic scholars across the university who are going to offer us 5 or so minutes of thoughts and provocations. I've organized them alphabetically by first name. Avery August's parents have seen this coming. So, Avery, you're up first.
Thank you, Suman, and thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts, and really appreciate putting together this event. I think it's past timely to continue to think about how we actually engage around these topics. I didn't think I would be first. I thought I would be following others. So, so as I've been thinking about, the particular topic, in particular the questions that I thought we might want to grapple with, I thought it'd be useful to share my thoughts about how we got here. And one of the things that's really interesting as a scientist is to think about how we actually get to do science. How is it supported? Thinking about the evolution of science funding, starting with Vannevar Bush's ideas about funding science with the NSF and the growth of the NIH funding and budgets. And the fact that in many ways, the US really capitalized on the fact that universities are filled with very, very smart people who are doing research. And what they can do is leverage the talent in the universities and get more, in a way, bang for the funding buck to support the research that scientists are doing at universities, which is a little bit different in some other countries where research is done in research institutes, and universities are largely teaching institutions that prepare citizens for the future. But it was a really interesting idea to do that. And of course, as that funding increased, there were other mechanisms that took advantage of the research that was coming out of those universities to leverage them for economic growth. The patent ability for universities and their scientists to file patents to protect materials that are then leveraged by companies, spin-off companies, and that became the story of science. This connection between government funding for research that then can be leveraged by the country in its businesses to grow as a scientific enterprise. And so that was a sort of a positive story. But what it didn't do, in my view, was to really connect how we actually do science with this positive story. And so we end up, as scientists and as science communicators, as reporters that report on science, reporting on how we do science in very definitive ways. Papers are published that say, this actually causes cancer, this treats cancer. We hear many stories, and we joke among my colleagues that we've cured cancer in mice 1,000 times, because we have. But the stories that come out are, various things like that. So the public then gets this view that science is definitive, that science is not progressive in the way that we understand it's progressive. And you say progressive, meaning we make progress, we understand certain ideas, but we continue to interrogate them the way that we do as scientists, and we may change the direction of that. And I think this came to a head most prominently using the COVID vaccine, where there were always, as an immunologist, there were always concerns among the community about the side effects of vaccines. Vaccines do have real side effects, but it was very well understood that the side effects were minimal compared to the benefit for society. And we've seen those charts of the introductions of vaccines, like smallpox vaccines and other vaccines, more recently, where you start to see the incidences of those infectious diseases dramatically drop after vaccinations. And that was a positive story. What we didn't tell is that the way we develop those vaccines requires understanding of how infections work, requires further research into improving the technology and the approaches that we have, and sits in the background. Some vaccines lose their efficacy, and we introduce new vaccines. We were not as definitive as we made the case to be for something like the COVID vaccine. So when the COVID vaccine was introduced, there was a lot of concern about how quickly it was developed. Of course, it was developed because there was lots of research behind it, so we were moving quickly. We did more in parallel than we normally do in developing vaccines. And we have to continue to improve on vaccines. So as the virus evolves, vaccines change. We see that in the flu, and we talk about that all the time. So this lack of understanding on our part in explaining as scientists how we actually do science, I think contributed to the surprise that many in the community feel when 6 months after we say one thing, we say something different that might seem at odds or might seem opposite to what we just said. Our masks protected, 6 feet between individuals, as we understood how the pandemic was evolving. And normally this happens, but not in such a prominent way. And so that's, I think, part of what contributed to now, to my alarm, a significant proportion of the world's communities sort of hesitancy, or even in some cases antagonism against vaccines, which has now spread to other parts of medical research. We've actually seen individuals like Anthony Fauci, who led the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. Huge stature in the community, huge stature in terms of his work with HIV, AIDS, which were developing universal vaccines. Now is a pariah for much of the world, largely because of the way that the information that we developed and evolved over time over the COVID pandemic has been weaponized by some for other means. And so I think one of the things we have to do going forward then is understanding how we need to, within universities, among the scientific community, talk more about how we do our work, what we do, and engage more with the public, such that we can be more honest about what our findings are, how confident we are in our publications and what we actually report, but also engage with the community so that they can understand better the work that we do. So this idea of living within our laboratories, within the universities, engaging with our own communities in terms of the scientific communities, and really not engaging in a broad-based way with the rest of the community, but saying, trust us, we're scientists, I think is something that we really need to interrogate and think about how we actually do that in a different way. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to my colleagues.
All right, thanks. All right, so our next speaker is Jamila Michener, Director of the Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures and Associate Professor of Government.
Right. Solidarity, Avery, none of us like our pictures.
I got all smiling eyes.
But it's so unrealistic. People expect you to be smiling when they see you. Okay. Hi everyone. So I'm Jamila Mitchell. I'll continue the conversation. I'm just mindful. I'll try to stay to 5 minutes. 5 minutes is actually really hard. And I'll do that just by focusing in the space that is most familiar to me. So as a researcher, I'm a political scientist by training, and I study racial inequality and economic inequality, and I think about the political causes and consequences of those forms of inequality, and I think about the relationship between public policy, government policy, and those forms of inequality, both politically and materially. For reasons that I imagine nobody in this room has a hard time imagining or a hard time understanding, it is a particularly volatile environment for studying racism and poverty and inequality, especially for studying the politics of those things. And a volatile time to be at the helm of a center that has the title Racial Justice and Equitable Futures in it. And if you're thinking about asking me, as many people have, whether it might be prudent to change the name of the center, don't. I didn't make the name of the center. And the center wasn't my idea. So whoever created the name, and that would be the university. If they want to change it, they should do so, but I won't. And in any case, you know, one of the things as I was reflecting on the theme for today, science under siege, that struck me, well, there are a few things that struck me. One is that the kind of research that I do, in many ways has perpetually and perennially been under siege. And so I think people expect me to be more panicked than I am, in part because I'm like, well, there have always been people who have not been a fan of and supported research like the research I do. The amount of power and influence that those folks have ebbs and flows over time, and what the consequences are of the volatility or the dislike for the research ebbs and flows over time. But the fact that there have essentially always been people, both in the US context and globally, who didn't recognize this even as science or as scientific, right? The enterprise of learning, for example, about inequality, its contours, its consequences, as an element, a part and parcel of science, particularly when that knowledge concerned Black folks, or when it concerned people of color, or other people in the categories of others, that questioned as a part of science in the first instance has a long history, and then deployed for all sorts of purposes, both good and ill, right? So there's a whole science of racism, a science that says, let's study how small Black people's brains are, and we're gonna deploy that as science, a science that reinforces their inferiority. So the relationship between the kind of research I do and quote unquote science as it's understood and supported and deployed in political spaces has long been fraught. So it's hardly surprising to me that it continues to be fraught. Again, although no false equivalencies, the contours, the nature, and the consequences of that are shifting. And they're certainly shifting now in ways that, of course, I find appalling and disturbing, but not exactly novel, right? And that's important. The question of where we are is always in part a reflection of the question of where we have been. And sometimes it helps to stabilize us a little bit, right? For me, it helps to know it's been difficult for scholars to study these kinds of things before, and they've done it anyway. And they've done it well, and they've found places for having support in the context of doing so, and they put the work to good use, regardless of hostile or volatile contexts, right? So that centers and grounds our work to remember some of these historical realities, and it also centers and grounds the role of the university in that work. One of the reasons why scholars have been able to study racial inequality, we can't change something that we don't understand. So we have to, regardless of what anyone says, we have to understand the nature of inequality. Because to the extent that it's a problem, and I would argue that it is, and I think many people would agree, we can only gain traction on changing that problem if we understand the nature of the problem and the nature of the processes that might be brought to bear to change the problem, and that's called politics, right? So we have to study these things, we have to understand them, we have to have deep knowledge of them, and we have to have a sense of how to put that knowledge to work, right? Avery, when he was speaking, kept using the word engage, engage, engage. That's about putting the knowledge to work. Those things are necessary, but where are the institutions that will preserve those prerogatives in the face of pushback, right? And the university is one such institution. It's not the only one, but it's a primary one. And so precisely the fact that science is under siege brings into sharp relief the importance of the university as an institution, both in the US and globally, but it also brings into sharp relief the weaknesses of the university, especially in the contemporary moment, our extensive reliance on federal funding, which may translate into having to look, as Suman suggested, for other sources now that can potentially compromise us in other ways, right? And our operations, which are, honestly, if we're honest with ourselves, increasingly corporatized. And there's benefits to that and there's disadvantages. So this is really a moment where we both have to recognize the centrality of the university as an institution that allows important kinds of work that may be more or less popular over time to continue irrespective of their popularity because of their importance for society. The university is an institution that allows for that, but it's also a university, an institution that, notwithstanding its strengths, has a number of weaknesses, and those have ebbed and flowed over time. And recognizing those, and in this moment we're forced to recognize those, and that could either cause us to pull back, or it can help us to reevaluate. How do we build resilience into institutions like universities? And how might we get better at doing that? So moments like this don't catch us in the way that they've caught us now. And the last thing I'll say is that in the context of doing all this, I do think it's particularly important for us to think of ourselves as connected, irrespective of the kind of research that we do. So a lot of people, they literally visually see me, or they know what I do, or they see something in a role or a title that I have, and the first thing they're like is, oh no, this must be a really hard time for you, right? And that's fair, but actually, this should be a really hard time for all of us. And it doesn't quite matter whether you study plants, or amoeba, or black people. The threat is against the university as an institution. The threat is against science as an enterprise, and that involves all of us. And to the extent that we see ourselves as separated, we, I think, lose opportunities to think about how to act collectively and in solidarity. And whether you're excited about racial inequality as a research topic or not, and irrespective of what you study, we're tethered in a particular way in the context of this institution. And what does that mean about how we ought to be acting in relation to each other and in relation to the institution? I think there are really important questions there that I hope this moment, difficult as it may be, gives us an opportunity to grapple with in ways we perhaps haven't before. Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks Jamila. So our next speaker, hopefully he doesn't hate his photograph, is Peter Lewin, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Government.
That's a picture of me when I was younger, but every picture of you is a picture of you when you were younger. It's a logically necessary condition. It's nice to be here, I guess, to talk about these things. I think all of us would prefer to not be in a moment in which it feels like there's a lot of external pressure on universities, in which it feels like it's a difficult time for universities to figure out what our way forward is in the next months and things. And a lot of this is very current, as you know, because there's been big changes in proposed funding structures from the federal government, and there's been larger kind of external forces which are quite severe actually coming down on universities. I thought I might just, because I don't want to say too much because Avery's here, and I think Avery understands the risk of whatever we say could cost us money. But let me just say a couple of things about how I think about moments like this. And I'll just say that I'm new to Cornell. I arrived in August from Canada. You'll pick it up from the accent maybe. But I'll say that Cornell is a place to marvel at. And if you read, for example, the really nice history of Cornell by Altshuler and Kramnik, you get a sense of how complex the creation of this university has been, how difficult it's been, and how much it's reflected a very long-term partnership between governments, so the state of New York, the federal government, through a lot of different offices, through a lot of private money where people have decided to give back to Cornell because they have a relationship to it. And then a lot of parents and people and kids who've come independently, but families who have sent their students here for a long, long time. And it is actually a kind of the proper use of the word, a marvelous thing, how tremendous of a university has been built. But from the beginning, it's been a partnership between a lot of different people who have had varying claims of authority over that partnership, but nonetheless have had some moral claim on what this university is doing. From the private money that came from Ezra Cornell and the land grant money that came through that, which is itself a very interesting and complicated story and one that's really worth getting to know, through engagement with the state of New York and the SUNY system, through all the kind of funding. This is the stuff which is bread and butter for STS, so I won't display my ignorance, but everything that's been done through various offices in the federal government, from the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, all the way through the NSF and the NIH and all these other organizations. For a long time, it's a long way of saying for a long time it's been a partnership. And in a partnership, one party doesn't get to determine the terms. They determine them together, right? So when the federal government says we're going to stop paying 60% overhead for NIH, that is, and this was articulated very well, I think, by my colleague off last week, that's not what the partnership has been. Right? The partnership has been that you can build out world-class universities in the United States. They will do research for the long term. They will be global magnets for talent. And it's costly to do that. And one way that we do that is by having overheads that we charge. But it turns out these don't come from God. These were negotiated over time, and there's a functional reason for them. And in a partnership, it's never good when one partner decides to unilaterally change the terms of things. But when that happens, you have to reassess who your partner is. So that's a long way of saying that what goes on here is not, we can talk about questions of fairness, we can talk about questions of efficiency, and we can think about exactly what we think the optimal mix of federal funding should be. But this is about public money that the public has decided to give us for some periods of time. And they've given us our charter, and they've given us a partnership through SUNY, et cetera, et cetera. So thinking about this, it's very hard in some ways to think about it from multiple dimensions, but thinking about what the public is asking of universities, what it expects, and whether we're up to the snuff of that is actually, I think, a very good question for us. It's a disciplining one. And I think that the more you actually get into the story of what it is that universities provide to the public for the money that it gives, the better the story is. We actually do research that changes the world, right? That helps us understand not only this world, but the reaches of other ones. I think during COVID, Cornell particularly demonstrated how well science could be deployed to a current problem that was extremely, extremely costly. But that, I think, has to be the posture in this. It's not productive overall for the posture to be one of, you used to give this to us anymore, you're not giving this to us now, and this is just completely devastating to us, right? There has to be more than that in our articulation of why we shouldn't be put under siege, right? And why we are a good partner and we're a good source of knowledge creation. I'll say just maybe two other things rapidly, and then I'll turn the mic over. I think Avery really touched, I'll echo Avery's comments and say them back in a way that, for how they resonated for me, but I'm a social scientist, I'm a scholar of public opinion and behavior, so when COVID occurred, and I was trying to figure out what to do, it was for me a privilege to be able to do a lot of research. I was in Canada at the time, and to do a lot of research. We were doing weekly surveys of more people than anyone else in the country about how people were thinking about COVID, responding to it, learning about it. It helped us plug in, my lab and I and other collaborators, into the public health infrastructure in Canada and into the public administrative infrastructure that was dealing with this. It was one of the most privileged points in my life that I felt like I could do something with my science that was useful. And when I look back on that time, it was a remarkably challenging time for science, because we were trying to figure out how to deploy knowledge in a way where there were assumptions about what kind of knowledge should be deployed, who should be listened to. We were making all sorts of implicit assumptions about timelines, about what things we should optimize on in terms of balancing liberties and public health, for example, or any other number of challenges. I think universities came through that time pretty well, but I think actually, as the dust settles on this, and it continues to, it is just a fantastic case study for how universities and how science can be communicated effectively and how it becomes communicated ineffectively. And if you think that a 3 or 4 year timeline is too long to look at things like backlash as against expertise, I submit that no, actually we're in a decades-long struggle over credibility and expertise right now. So I think it's really worth us spending as much time as we can thinking about what that looked like. Third and final comment. This one is aimed, I guess, as much at physical scientists as it is anybody else. The way we've decided to fund science, the way we fund laboratories, the way we do collaborative research, again, it's not exogenously determined. It's all endogenous to the money that we've got and choices that get made. Maybe we're on the cusp of an incredibly exciting time when people who are coming into science, new hires, people who are coming here as new colleagues, or just people generally operating in universities, are looking at a much different funding environment. And maybe the potential for that to spur innovation about how we do science collectively, how we think about the capitalization of scientific costs. This is the kind of stuff that gets Dean excited, so I don't care if you don't get excited about it. I've got 30 seconds left. But I'll just say that I think that there's a real opportunity here for us to think a little bit about, if we're in a world in which we're going to have constraints, serious constraints on the amount of capital available for science because of huge cuts to the federal government. They're our partner in this, right? If they walk away from that partnership, it takes a long time to fill that back in. It may well spur very interesting conversations about how we do physical science, how we do social science, how we do the humanities, in ways where we may not want to have those conversations, but if you have a crisis, it's something you shouldn't waste as a chance to try to figure out how you can do things differently. That's, I mean, what a thing, right? Come up here and say, well, there's a great opportunity in all this crisis, but if we're looking for a bright spot, it may well be that it gives us a chance to pause and think about how we would do things differently if we were in this environment for a long time, and maybe try to find a little bit of innovation in that. Thanks very much, Simone, for organizing this, and I look forward to hearing from everybody else. Thanks.
Fantastic. So our next speaker is Rebecca Slayton, Director of the Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and Associate Professor in Science and Technology Studies.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan, for organizing this and for everyone for coming out. I'm going to talk very briefly about science, technology, and security. And boy, that was not the first slide I expected. That's okay. So by security, I want to say I mean both national security and human security. So national security has traditionally meant protecting a nation's institutions, economy, and people from harms. Human security is a broader and more pervasive concept. As defined by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2000, it means freedom from want, freedom from fear, and the freedom of future generations to inherit a healthy natural environment. And Annan proposed that human security was the foundation of national security, but too often it's been used as an excuse to violate human security. So insecurity, whether of people or nations, is generally thought of in my field as the product of threats and vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that threats can exploit. So a threat without a vulnerability to exploit is not a security risk. To give just one example, the US has threatened Canada and Mexico with tariffs. It's not yet clear whether that's a real vulnerability. They were quickly suspended, still being threatened. Conversely, a vulnerability without a threat is also not a security risk. So this is one reason that Canadians have traditionally disdained Americans but not feared them. So the US could, in fact, drop a bomb on Toronto, a nuclear bomb, but it has shown little interest in doing so. We did accidentally bomb Greenland and North Carolina, fun fact, that's a different story. So most governments try to develop science and technology that will reduce their vulnerability to their most significant threats. So calls for a border wall, positive threats from immigrants, calls for nuclear modernization, that is developing large numbers of new nuclear weapons aimed to counter threats from Russia and China, which are also building up their nuclear arsenals. The history also shows that we've often gotten our threat models wrong. So we've invested in science and technology to protect us from one kind of threat and then another emerges. And the United States, just to give one example, lacks the security infrastructure that might have stopped the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. So what I'd suggest we are seeing today is both deliberate decisions to increase US scientific and technological vulnerability to well-known threats, as well as the rise of a new level of threat that we have not developed science or technology to counter. And I'll give just a few examples from the area of cybersecurity. So for the last 30 years or so, the US government has been working very hard to reduce vulnerability to a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, which are things like electricity grids, petroleum, pipelines, refineries, factories, much more. But the government organizations that, and I won't read all these acronyms, there's been a lot of government organizations started to counter these sorts of things, and they are currently being disbanded or gutted. There's also been increasing concern about foreign influence campaigns, particularly since the 2016 election. And the government has established a number of task forces and provided funding to counter foreign influence. Our current administration has decided to accept vulnerability to these campaigns, dismantling a few more acronyms, but people doing real work that were involved with countering election interference. And then the third thing I'll just mention very briefly, the US government has developed technological and procedural safeguards to reduce vulnerability to insiders who leak classified information or who weaponize personal information in databases. So for example, selling somebody's social security number, or doing something with somebody's information as a kind of personal vendetta. But none of those safeguards matter when the owners of the system itself go rogue. And I'd argue that's what we're seeing today, when a team of unelected technologists led by Elon Musk, with no accountability or security checks, demand access to the personal data of millions of citizens. And we have no kind of constitutional kill switch, right, to stop unconstitutional behavior on the part of the executive branch of government. So our systems are here designed for one set of threats, and now we're confronting another. So I'll conclude very briefly by noting that these threats and vulnerabilities are not fundamentally new. So in times of crisis, of course, it's easy to romanticize the past, but the seeds of our current threats and vulnerabilities were planted a long time ago, and minoritized communities in this country, including Indigenous people, Black Americans, LGBTQ people, many others, have been mindful of threats from within the US government for a really long time. It's the ascendance and the level of the threat that feels new to many people. And it also calls for some creativity in envisioning how science and technology might be redesigned and reconfigured for a more just future. So, thank you.
Our next speaker is Sarah Pritchard, Professor of Science and Technology Studies.
All right. In some ways, I want to spend my 5 minutes listing off forbidden words, but I'm not going to do that. The title of the roundtable is Science Under Siege, but I want to note that it's not just science. It's the arts, humanities, social sciences, it's individual disciplines like history, one of my disciplines, including the quite overt erasure and distortion of history by official government entities that we saw recently, for instance, at Stonewall. It's also siege in terms of knowledge and movements that have tried to address longstanding and also current problems and inequalities, including environmental knowledge and environmentalisms. Oops, we're supposed to be here. So I want to make a couple of comments about the politicization and gutting of the environmental sciences, legislation, and movements. But let me say that environmental knowledge, law, policy, and movements, and even the very idea of quote-unquote the environment itself, are always already political. They have long and very contested histories in diverse contexts. And we shouldn't also ignore some of the politics of the environmental sciences or certain movements, both in the past and the present. They are not necessarily progressive. A few quick examples: the establishment of US national parks dependent on indigenous dispossession, the ways in which fundamental concepts in modern ecology, such as ecosystem and ecosystem ecology, were indebted to atomic testing in the Pacific Ocean. Although Leopold, who's often, too often in my view, a hagiographic figure in ecology, was in close conversation with eugenicists, and I could go on and on here. And I also want to emphasize that this isn't entirely past, it's also present. For instance, there was an individual on Twitter, I couldn't find the tweet at this point, but this individual proclaimed during the height of the COVID pandemic that extra COVID deaths would help address environmental issues. So again, this isn't past, it's present. But in the current moment, we are witnessing the rolling back of environmental legislation and the undermining of environmental institutions, which have often provided, in reality, only partial and piecemeal efforts to ensure environmental quality for both people and nature in the context of industrialization, high modernist economies, both capitalist and socialist, and globalization. We're seeing the undermining of environmental right-to-know efforts during the 1970s and 80s, often pushed by environmental justice activists, who I'll get to in a second here, to ensure industry transparency about production and disposal. We are witnessing the active denial of environmental injustice as an empirically documented historical fact, and gutting of associated efforts to develop, albeit belatedly and only partially, institutional, legal, and financial support to redress decades of environmental racism and environmental inequalities. And we are witnessing attacks on disciplines and institutions that have produced important environmental knowledge, particularly since World War II, including the strategic mobilization of uncertainty, something that Avery alluded to, and the production of environmental ignorance, we call this agnotology in STS, for quite vested economic and political interests. We're also seeing controlling access to and destruction of environmental data. We can think of this as the modern digital version of book bans and book burning, and banning words and concepts such as climate change and environmental justice, which we might think of as epistemic censorship. And I'll tell you, it's very interesting to teach a survey course on environmental ethics this spring. I thought about putting up a page of my syllabus and blacking out all the words that are banned, but I didn't. bother doing that, you can imagine. Now, as all my colleagues have emphasized, none of this is entirely new. These arguments and actions are rooted in earlier processes, many of which are not overtly environmental. What's happening is part of what Suman called a slow-moving disaster over, I would say, roughly the last 50 or 60 years. But clearly, the scale, the pace, the executive orders, and not following constitutional processes are new. And we could enumerate some of those longer processes. Again, not all of them are overtly environmental. I actually want to turn to several very small ways forward, and I'll let my esteemed colleagues, they've already talked about a number of the ways that we might look at this on higher levels. But I want to point to some current efforts and recent efforts, many of which started in November 2016 to try to address some of these issues. One is the establishment of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, known as EDGI, here, which was established in November 2016, again, think about timing, which seeks to advance environmental right to know and protect vulnerable environmental data. And I want to emphasize that environmental data means also environmental data, but environmental data in the interest of people and communities. Several other projects, the Public Environmental Data Partners, which among other efforts has recently released an initial reconstruction of the EPA's environmental justice screening, which has been banned and taken off the website. One of my fields is environmental history. There's an action collaborative which has annotated Project 2025 and written a number of op-eds. I also want to encourage all of us to consider donating to and volunteering for existing community organizations at various scales, some very, very local, some more national and international, but particularly environmental justice organizations. And I also want to emphasize that white folks like myself need to step back and listen and follow the lead and support and prerogatives of leaders, many of whom have been working for a very, very long time, often without support. One of those organizations is Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign. He was a MacArthur winner a few years ago, which has sought to unite civil rights and environmentalism. And there's actually a longer history of the entanglement of these movements, which have often been overlooked. And also the efforts, intellectual and activist and otherwise, by Leah Thomas, who is an absolutely amazing young woman who has developed the concept of intersectional environmentalism and has really tried to enact this in various domains. And she's also written a book. I think she's 25 at this point, if I recall correctly. So those are just my comments, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Okay, we have one more speaker, and then we're going to throw this open to all of you, so get ready. Our final speaker is Stephen Hilgard, a Professor of Science and Technology Studies. Yep, Steve.
Thank you, Suman. So I think that in addition to being a little bit younger in that picture, I'm also wearing the same jacket. Okay, so our topic is Science Under Siege, and this is a headline from the AAAS journal Science from February 7th. The siege is actually bigger than just science. It would make perfect sense to just take that word out. And in fact, whoops, we could take this one out, all of that out. He's producing chaos, or his administration is producing chaos on a world scale. And so how should we think about this situation we face? And one way to consider it is to use a term that some political scientists and legal scholars use, the notion of a constitutional moment, a period in which things are fundamentally unsettled, and how the socio-political order is going to resettle is up for grabs. And how should we think about science in particular if we think about this in terms of a constitutional moment? And one way would be to think about science, and we've been talking a lot about universities, and the university as a potential casualty of this broader constitutional moment. But I want to suggest that we should think about it as much more centrally involved in what it is that's happening and has happened. So I'm going to argue for this later interpretation and move the discussion from my point of view back to broader issues of political theory. And obviously, lots of things are responsible for our plight, the Trump election, the whole sort of thing that's gone on here. But one of them is a failure to build a politics of science that's viable in our world today. And there are many people in STS, most notably Steve Chapin and Schaffer, Bruno Latour, Sheila Jasanoff, and Yaron Ezrahi, who all have talked about how in the early modern period, and as the Enlightenment takes shape, as democracies take over from monarchies, a division is established between two kinds of worlds, in a way. A world of facts, decided through a scientific process, and a world of values, fought over and decided through a political process. And both of those are contentious worlds in which people argue about things. But as we've moved since the time of the founding of the American state, the role of science in maintaining the central interests of the state have expanded. All of my colleagues spoke about this in some kind of way. These are just rough markers of the times that we're talking about, but the protection of vital technological systems is a very 20th century phenomenon, and 21st century phenomenon. Now worries about the technological future, so that these are issues that have gotten tangled into the very fabric of our politics, and how good a job do we do at deciding that? Now, if you look at the attacks on science today, they aren't primarily on areas of science that are far removed from these kinds of matters. There's not a lot of people saying, maybe they'll say cosmology isn't interesting, we shouldn't fund it for monetary reasons, but they're not going to say cosmology is a dangerous area where people are fabricating data wildly and you can't trust them and things like that. What we have instead is a focus on what you could call regulatory science, that's a term in the field, or you could say policy relevant science. But whether you're on the left or the right, people are worried about regulatory science, whether it's from corporate capture on the left, untrustworthy pharmaceutical companies on the left, or overreach, overreaction, the kinds of things you get around mask mandates and things like that. So the situation is that regulatory science isn't like research science. It's got a number of special characteristics. It operates in a hybrid space where questions of facts and questions of value are really deeply entangled. And unlike research science, you've got to make decisions. And you've got to make these decisions in a situation where regulatory science is very often dealing with the new, the emerging, the uncertain, and even things we don't know yet. So it's a very treacherous domain in that respect. And so if we're trying to regulate AI when we haven't even defined what AI is, it becomes a bit of a problem. And these kinds of time pressures aren't found in research science. If you're doing cosmology, it's really interesting, space science, this is great, I love it, but you don't need to find the answer tomorrow. And another feature of it is there's no way not to act. Decision makers must take action. They either have to choose not to act, which is an active choice, or take action. And in that kind of context, regulatory science has to do what it does, which is set thresholds. Is the risk low? Is the risk medium? Is the risk high? The CDC is saying, last time I checked, that the risk of bird flu is low. That's based on a bunch of experts estimating a whole bunch of different variables which get aggregated to produce a number between 1 and 10, and that number, if it's less than 3.9, the risk is low. Okay, that is a process that is easily deconstructed. It's not something that you can sort of say doesn't rest on some combination of conventions, precedents, and political choices. And so in that situation, it's very hard for regulatory science to exercise authority and retain its political legitimacy. And the reason for that is that it's surrounded by interested parties, as I suggested before, who are both on the left and the right are likely to critique it. So, in the various pandemics that have been declared to be infectious disease outbreaks of concern, the World Health Organization has been attacked either for overreacting or underreacting in every case. And in regulatory science, decisions about when to treat a contested claim as a fact for purposes of action is a evaluated decision. The threshold is not set by some sort of immutable scientific standard. When you have different kinds of evidence, different evidence streams that aren't in the same category, it becomes very difficult. And so in an environmental area, Sarah mentioned environmental issues, in an environmental area where you're talking about a risk, the kind of set of questions that get asked are to ensure that we, whoever that is, are safe from which threats, how much do which of us need to be regulated, and in what ways, and for how long, and with what burdens, and imposed on who, and according to whose assessment of what kinds of evidence, and which values, and under what forms of legal and political authorization. That's what is being contested. That is what the kinds of issues that we're talking about in this hybrid space. So the question then to ask, given the entanglement of science with the politics of our time, where almost every political issue has technical components, can we keep pretending? And what's the cost of continuing to pretend that this is the kind of division that's operative? Can we continue to pretend that these hybrids don't exist? And can we still think with this framework? And if we do, I'll argue that we just got to see two different types of problems. One of them is charges of technocratic overreach as unaccountable experts seize more power than they're due. The other one is the argument that politics has contaminated science or scientific institutions or procedures and knowledge. You're going to get a discourse of fake science with claims of corruption everywhere. Think climate science, the IPCC's faking its data, blah, blah, blah. In either case, failing to recognize the existence of hybrids leaves no room for a kind of collective deliberation in which the broader hybrid questions are brought out. If you're trying to announce from on high decisions based in the science, you're going to run into these kinds of problems. And this is a paper that my colleagues and I published. It's sort of a spin-off from a study we did of COVID that looked at how different countries were handling the COVID response. And, it's not, it was published in about actually 4 years ago, almost to the day. And this statement, if you treat people as irredeemably irrational and ignorant, it's going to be like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Policy institutions will tend to call forth the kinds of resistant citizens that they imagine they're addressing. I'm not going to claim that that's exactly a prediction, but I'm going to say that that's a big part of what accounts for some of the loss of strength in the election. And this points to a few really simple but highly controversial, I suspect, ideas about how we should deal with this situation. One is, let us stop calling people anti-science. It's really doesn't make any sense. Elon Musk is anti a lot of institutions. He's anti-university. He's for something for sure, but it's hard to identify precisely what it is. But you can't really say that man is anti-science when he wants to build the STEM capacity to fly to Mars and terraform it and so forth. Calling people anti-science looks like something that would have been out of a ill-fated self-help book called How Not to Make Friends with Your People. So, and then further, let's stop justifying decisions by framing them as being evidence-based policy. The policy is never based on the evidence alone. What we need to do instead is find ways to build evidence-informed deliberation, democratic deliberation, informed by evidence, but not based on evidence and not announced from on high, from a technical pedestal. So science isn't under siege by itself. Much more broad issues are involved. The democratic state is what is under siege. And part of the reason is that we haven't found ways to address the problem of hybrids of the scientific and the political in the questions that everywhere surround us. Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of the Science Under Siege Roundtable. Just some initial first impressions. First of all, I was actually impressed by the lack of hysteria and reasonableness of the discussions. In part, that was due to the fact that the indirect cost rate cuts were not really at issue. I have to say that it wasn't entirely clear to me from the presentations that science actually is under siege. Most of the people who were speaking today were not scientists. They were administrators, historians of science. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I would have enjoyed hearing from actual working scientists to see what their thoughts were on this. Anyway, I'll have some more comments, no doubt, as we go along. And that's it for us today at Cornell University. Again, I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars.